So, hi everyone. Welcome to today's session. We're here today to talk to you about DBS checks in the faith sector to mark World Religion Day 2024. My name is Lizzie Bittington. I'm one of the regional outreach advisors and I cover the East Midlands region. I'll let my colleague introduce himself.
Hello, my name is Sean and I am the regional outreach advisor for Northern Ireland.
Thanks very much, Sean. Yeah, so we're here today to talk to you about DBS checks in the faith sector to really give you a very quick glimpse of the sort of things that you need to understand when you're applying for DBS checks, whether that be for volunteers or for paid roles within your different religious settings. So a brief introduction to get us started. What we're going to talk about today, of course, as I said, is DBS checks in the faith sector, but we must let you know what the purpose of the disclosure and barring service is. So our purpose is to protect the public by helping employers make safer recruitment and employment decisions, and by barring individuals who pose a risk to vulnerable people. Now, it's a very important job, of course, but it doesn't mean anything unless we're working with other organisations that work directly with vulnerable people and with children, which of course lots of different faith settings do. So there's lots of resources available that you can look into if you wish to. You can look into the DBS strategy, which is currently coming towards the end of our current time frame, which is 2020 to 25. That is available on www.dbs.gov.uk. You can also find our DBS business plan as well, so please feel free to read that. And a little note before I continue is to say that all of the information that we're talking about today, we're only giving you a snapshot. And we do, Sean and I and the rest of our team, deliver workshops to organisations across the countries that we cover. And we are available to offer free, full-length training if that is something that you would like to consider. Okay. So a little bit about the role of the disclosure and barring service. So we are responsible for the delivery of disclosure and barring functions on behalf of the government. So what this really means is that we do those things, but we don't necessarily have control over the legislation itself, because it is the legislation that underpins everything that we do. So when it comes to the disclosure functions, we carry these out within England, Wales, Jersey, Guernsey and the Isle of Man under Part 5 of the Police Act 1997. We also have the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act, which is specifically the Exceptions Order 1975, Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act 2006, and the Protection of Freedoms Act 2012. This legislation empowers us to do DBS checks, to share information on a certificate, what kind of information actually is shared and what level of check you can apply for depending on the role, which is the big question and one of the things we're having a little look at today. But it really does allow us to do those things, but it is a complicated area sometimes to put into practice this legislation that is in a way one size fits all. So DBS does have lots of resources available. We've got videos, leaflets, workforce guides, and of course you have the regional outreach team as well. And we are here, as I've already said, to help if you need that. And then just a little mention about barring. We're not really talking about that today because we're focusing on the DBS checks themselves. But as you can see, if you look at the slide, we do carry out the barring functions in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Of course, that's Sean's area, so he knows lots about that. And we use very similar legislation to do those functions as well. So again, you can see the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act comes up again, and the Protection of Freedoms Act 2012. But what I'm going to do now is pass on to Sean, who will just briefly touch upon the DBS checks themselves.
Thank you, Lizzie. Okay, so as Lizzie said, there's a lot of information here, but we are just going to touch on it lightly. So I would just, reassure you that there are guides on the DBS website that can explain the eligibility for each of these checks, and but I'll just go to give you a brief touch on what each check is. Okay, so starting from left to right there, we have the basic check. Okay, so there's no eligibility criteria there, and anyone can be asked to get a check and can apply as an individual on the DBS website. Okay. Next up there, that would also include unspent convictions and conditional cautions on there. Okay, so after that we have the standard check. Now the eligibility for that is set out in the Rehabilitation of Offenders Exception Order, and for the most part this covers specific roles such as becoming like a barrister or people who work in the judicial court system and those who work in healthcare but don't deliver healthcare itself. Okay, but they do have contact with patients. All right. Now this would include spent and unspent convictions. Moving up then, we have an enhanced check. Now, eligibility for these checks is set out in the Police Act regulations, and for the most part covers those who work with either children and adults meeting the criteria, but not in regulated activity. Okay, and this would include spent and unspent convictions and relevant police information. And that is any information that a chief officer reasonably believes to be relevant to the workforce or role being applied for, and that it ought to be disclosed. Okay, and moving on again, we have the enhanced with barred list. Eligibility is again in the Police Act regulations, which sets out when barred list information should be disclosed. Now, this is often linked to whether someone is working in regulated activity with either children or adults. And this includes everything on the enhanced with a check on one or both barred lists also. Okay, and I would like to highlight at this point that the standard and enhanced checks, they're actually free for volunteers. Okay, plus any admin fee it might be from the umbrella organisation or the registered body. But you can look into that if you need any more information about that. Again, always just reach out. Okay. So again, just a brief introduction to one of the products we offer is the DBS update service. So this just allows you to, if you get your certificate, you can subscribe on a yearly basis to the update service, which really gives you a portable certificate. It means that you can, as an employer, you can access the information with the certificate owner's permission, of course. And that will, as long as you're using the same criteria, if you're looking for a check at the same level that it's on the certificate, then you can use that. Okay, and it's £13 for the yearly subscription. It is very useful for both employees and employers. Okay, and again, it's just a brief overview of it, and we can go into it in much more detail later on if you need to. Okay.
So, as a bit of an exercise for this mini session that we're doing today, we've got 4 different roles that we want to introduce you to show how you can apply DBS eligibility and understand what level of check to apply for each one. So we'll start with our first one. So this is a madrasa teacher. So they teach children at a madrasa or a mosque twice a week. They also have responsibility for supervising the children when they are in the class. So that's just an overview, a little bit of an understanding of what this particular role means. Of course, they can change. They can vary in different areas and across different faiths as well. So our first question is, which workforce will they be working with? So as we can see from this example, we can see that they work with children. And then if we ask our next question, are they doing an activity that is listed as regulated activity? Now, a little aside, in our full length workshops, we do break down exactly what we mean by regulated activity. And this is different between working with adults and working with children. So for the purpose of this, we're obviously giving you a very quick view into what regulated activity is. But what I can tell you is that teaching, training and instructing children is listed as a regulated activity. So the answer to this question is yes. Now, our next question to understand if this is definitely in regulated activity is, are they doing it often enough? So when it comes to teaching, training and instructing children, we know that there is a frequency requirement, and it's either doing it more than 3 times in a 30-day period, or at least once overnight between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. And we can see from this is very likely to be a daytime role. So we can assume that it is. And from the example, it happens at least twice a week. So that meets our frequency condition. And the answer to that question is yes as well. Now, there is one last question to understand if this is definitely in regulated activity, and it's, are they unsupervised? So this rule applies specifically to teaching, training and instructing children, and it's really important to know this. We don't actually within DBS have a legal definition of what supervision means, but we do have a factual note from the Department of Education that says that supervision is done by somebody else who was in regulated activity, but it's ultimately the discretion of the organisation to say if they feel whether or not somebody is supervised or unsupervised. I think with this role, because it says that they have the responsibility for supervising the children, we can assume that they are, yes, they are unsupervised. So the answer to all of these questions looks like it is all yeses. And as a result of that, we know that this person, anyone who was fulfilling this role, would be in regulated activity with children, and therefore they would be eligible for that highest level of check that Sean touched upon, the enhanced with the children's workforce and a check of the children's barred list. All right, I'm going to hand back to Sean for the next example.
Looking at the next rule here, we have a rabbi. Okay, and again, just we are touching on this very lightly, and anything we look at in your own instances would be on a case-by-case basis, just with your own circumstances. Okay, but again, these are general overviews. Okay, so we have a rabbi, and they lead prayer sessions and also provide pastoral care, including giving advice and guidance on emotional, physical, or educational well-being to children. The pastoral care for children happens about twice a month. Okay, so to work through this, then we would ask, which workforce will it be working with? Okay, so clearly it states there that it's children. Okay, and then next we would ask, are they doing an activity that is listed as regulated activity? Okay, and we would say yes, it is a regulated activity by providing advice or guidance or emotional, physical, educational well-being. Okay, so therefore that would lead us on to our next question, which would be, are they doing it more than 3 days in a 30-day period? In this case, they're not, okay, because we see that it's just roughly twice a month. Okay, so with these in place, then we would come to the conclusion that the rabbi would be eligible for an enhanced DBS check with the children's workforce. Now, the reason that it's not the higher level check with the barring list is due to the time frame. Okay, so they don't do the regulated activity often enough, so it is now therefore classed as work with children rather than regulated activity with children. We understand that that is a lot to take in, and this is a small sample for you, so please just use us and get in touch if you do need any more further guidance on that. It's all available for you. Okay, and I'm going to hand back to Lizzie now. I'm just going to give you another example.
Okay, so our third example is a volunteer community driver. Now, this person is responsible for picking up vulnerable adults in their community to take them to church and other community events. They do this individually at least once a week. Okay, so again, very similar first question is, which workforce will they be working with? Now, we can see by the example that it would be adults in this one. Now, I'm going to flesh this out a tiny bit more, because the example does say that they are vulnerable adults. DBS legislation doesn't actually have a definition of vulnerable adults, but we do have something listed in our work with adults guidance that specifies that in order to be eligible for that level, you have to have the adults in question of receiving the service have to be receiving a listed health or social care activity or a listed activity set out in legislation. By this example, I think we can assume that some of the adults, maybe they live in residential care homes, perhaps they need support to live independently. We know that they're not able to access the event without the driver because they can't get there. So what I'm going to say for the purposes of this example is that they are considered vulnerable from that DBS perspective. But we'll come back to why that's really important to understand in a second. The next question, as is with all of our examples, is are they doing an activity that is listed as regulated activity? Now, as I briefly mentioned, there is a difference between what is considered regulated activity with children and what is regulated activity with adults. And there is a rule with adults that conveying an adult for health, social care or personal care reasons due to age, illness or disability is regulated activity with adults. This example, however, doesn't fit that full criteria. Now, they may need support because of age, illness or disability, but they are not being taken to healthcare, personal care or social care appointments. So we know that it doesn't meet that condition and therefore is not regulated activity with adults. But the next question is, are they doing an activity that is classed as work with adults? This is why I mentioned who the adults are being important. So this, of course, is our next level down of understanding in terms of eligibility. There are 3 steps to understand when thinking about working with adults. Who the adults are is the first one, which we've just covered. Then the next, of course, is the activity itself. So there is an activity in work with adults that is driving adults under contract arrangements. Now, I would say that this is a volunteer role, but it is an organised arrangement that has been set up. It's not a personal responsibility or a favour. It is something that has been structured and set up by an organisation. So it would meet that criteria. So I would say, yes, it is a work with adults activity. And then the last point that we have to establish when understanding if somebody is in work with adults or not is frequency again. So very important for this one. Are they doing it often enough? Now, separately to the children's criteria, we've got weekly on an ongoing basis as one of our points for working with adults, but it also can be more than 3 times in a 30-day period or overnight between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. as well. But we can see by this example that they are doing it at least once a week, and therefore, yes, it is frequent enough. So we've got those answers. What does that end up being? Well, we would say this person, any volunteer community drivers with these specific circumstances would be eligible for the enhanced DBS check with the adults workforce. So it's not considered regulated activity with adults because there's different criteria for that, but they would be eligible for that other higher level check as well. So it's a good one to have. And of course, there are lots of resources available online about work with adults, including our adults workforce guide. But please feel free to reach out to the regional outreach team if you would like any extra support about this, because it is very complicated. And I'm going to hand back to Sean for the very last one.
Okay, so for our last example, we're going to look at the role of a Langar kitchen staff. Okay, now they volunteer to cook and serve food to the community. And this includes children and adults, but they don't have any supervision responsibilities. Okay, and they do help at the Langar at least 3 times a month. Okay, so working through our sort of our questions here, which workforce will they be working with? Well, it does state that they'll be working with children and adults, so they're both included there. Okay. Now, are they doing an activity that is listed as regulated activity? Well, for the purposes of a DBS check, cooking and serving food is not considered regulated activity. Okay, so that would be a no, not regulated activity. All right. Now, are they doing an activity that is classed as work with adults or work with children? In this case, no. For the technical purposes of a DBS check, again, cooking and serving food is not considered regulated activity, nor is it considered work with adults or children, even if they have contact with the community while they do it. So therefore, it doesn't even matter how frequently it happens. However, if they did have supervision of children as part of their responsibility, it would change this, because then they could be in work with children or regulated activity with children, and then the frequency would come into effect, and so as to be regulated activity, which of course would need to be more than 3 days in a 30-day period. Okay, so again, it's quite a simple one, but it does again highlight the fact that it is an absolutely case by case way to deal with it, and every sort of specific rule and responsibility is important, so that you can figure out for yourself what level of check you should be applying for. Okay, and Lizzie, I'll hand back to you now.
Well, thanks very much, Sean. So yeah, so I mean, with this one, I suppose it would end up being a basic check, but you don't have to get basic checks unless you feel that it is appropriate to do so. So
thank you.
The last content that we'll cover before we start wrapping up is talking about charity trustees. This is, of course, really important because across the whole of the country, the UK is in general, lots of different faith groups are considered charities. So what do you do about your charity trustees? There is a rule within DBS legislation that if you are considered either a children's charity or an adults charity from a DBS perspective, then the trustees would be eligible for enhanced level certificates with the respective workforce. The rule really is that if you are to be considered a children's charity, the work that you're doing within your church or your other faith setting, it has to be regulated activity with children. And then to be considered an adults charity, the work that you're doing has to either be within our legal definition of work with adults or regulated activity with adults. And if that is the case, then you can apply for the enhanced DBS check, even if the trustee doesn't have any other responsibilities within your group or your charity itself. If you don't meet this definition, then the trustees could still apply for a basic level check, a little bit like our Langer kitchen staff. You don't have to. It's about whether you feel that it is appropriate to ask them to get the basic DBS check, because there are no eligibility rules for that level of check, and you can make a suitability decision based on what that information comes back. But again, completely your discretion as to whether you choose to do that. And now I think what I'll do is I'll hand back to Sean for finishing up. But the thing I will say before I do so is please do get in touch with DBS Regional Outreach if you would like any additional support. We're very accessible, hopefully, very friendly and very welcoming of any requests for help. So I'm sure Sean will touch upon our contact details in a second, but that's a big thank you for listening from me.
Thank you, Lizzie. That's great. Yeah, so we're just going to finish up now. That's the bulk of the content covered there. I'm just going to really give you where to find some of our resources. And as we've said previously, there is so much information on there for you. For example, all of the DBS eligibility information is available at dbs.gov.uk. I would like to highlight just on this slide, there is a great leaflet for DBS checks for working with children in places of worship, and that could be found at www.gov.uk. Okay. Okay, and one other thing we would like to highlight with you, in 2021, DBS, we partnered with the SFI, which is the Strengthening Faith Institutions, to produce some guidance on DBS checks for different faith groups in the UK. Okay, you can access this guidance, which covers Islam, Judaism, Sikhism, Christianity, Hinduism, and Buddhism, by going to sfitogether.org. Okay, and on there you will find some more examples of particular rules, just like the ones we've went through, and there's lots of other great resources available too. Okay, now you can see there's our contact details there for us. We're very keen to build relationships with the faith sector, and to give you the tools and the information, the advice that you need, again, to help you make your safe and secure employment decisions, okay, whether that be with volunteers or paid roles, it doesn't matter, okay. So we are here, we are a safeguarding organisation, and we are very keen to create those relationships with yourselves as much as possible. So please use us, okay. And there is just a list of all the individual regional outreach advisors, okay. So, and we have national contacts as well, okay. So if you want to go higher level to the national, or if you want to go into your own particular region and create that relationship with your own particular regional outreach advisor, whatever works for you, we are happy to work with you, and as I say, get these relationships up and running, and see how we can help you. Okay, folks, thank you very much for your time today. Really appreciate that, and thanks for listening.